Hello,
Uh-oh.
Hello.
Hi, Rabbi, how are you?
Doing. Okay. Got a new set, a new room.
I see that.
This is it. Okay. Here we'll
The environment.
Donations. I gotta tell this story before we get started. My
Okay.
neighbor was very religious.
Who?
My neighbor next
Okay.
door before she passed away, very religious person. And she comes to me one day. Eaton Park has donated all these uniforms to her church.
Oh.
A container load, okay, a shipping container, right? And she asked me, how do you ship a container load of Eaton Park uniforms to Africa? So I explained to her who to talk to and what to do. But then I asked her, I said, don't you feel that people in Africa would not want to wear 100% polyester Eaton Park uniforms and schwitz like crazy? But somewhere in Africa, there's hundreds of thousands of people all wearing Eaton Park uniforms donated by this church, and they're all schwitzing away.
Well, Rabbi Aaron tells a story that someone was visiting Africa and some kid was walking around with like Jamie's bat mitzvah on her shirt. And they had to do research to find out how did they get Jamie's bat mitzvah, shirt, it was in Africa. So very nice. Well, it's 7 o'clock. Let's get started. Let's see, here we go. I'm gonna do a little mute all, but you can always unmute yourselves. So there we go. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Susie, Heidi, Joan, Irv, Richard, and Ellen. We've got Adult Ed. We had more people sign up last week than are on right now. Yeah, the ones who didn't read the email. So at the last minute, but now they're coming on. So here it goes. Let me just make sure, mute upon entry. Good. Hello, Deanne. We're going to get started on Talmud and Midrash. So I'm going to start off with, and if your screen still says, got it, you want to press got it. It's not going to go away until you press got it. So once upon a time, a long time ago, in a land far, far away, there was us. We get out, okay, we're Egypt, 400 years of slavery, cross the Red Sea, we get to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, and he's up there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he comes down with the Torah. Let's just say the Torah, just for the fun of it. Yes, the Christians will say he came down with the 10 commandments. Yes, the Jews were supposed to say he came down with the 613 commandments. Don't ask me how, that was a different class. This is Talmud and Midrash, but he came down with the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, whatever that means. The written Torah. What is the written Torah? 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So that is the written Torah. We take it out every Saturday morning, Monday and Thursday morning, Saturday afternoon. We read it, we close it up, we read it. We have a party in Simchas Torah. We start over. That's the written Torah. But there's also something called the oral Torah, the oral law. And what is the oral Torah, the oral law? It is the Talmud. Okay, the Talmud. Tonight is Talmud and Midrash. So how does the story go? Now we have the written Torah. Oh, sorry. Moses is up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. The rabbi said, it doesn't take 40 days and 40 nights to write a Torah. I think it probably takes longer, but Moses had extra time up there. Don't ask. Okay, so Moses is writing the Torah because God is transcribing. Okay, Moses is a stenographer, and that's what Hebrew is. It's a stenographer Hebrew for God. So Moses is writing the Torah, and Moses is writing and asking, and they're having a conversation, Moses and God. And Moses writes down, do not cook a baby goat in his mother's milk. So Moses looks up and says, God, what does that mean? And God says, no cheeseburgers. And then, there's lots of jokes that go with that, but we don't have time for jokes. Only So Moses keeps writing, and it says, stone your rebellious sons. And Moses says, how do you do that one? And God explains that we don't stone rebellious sons. It's not exactly the way, And okay, so Moses comes down with the written Torah, 5 books of Moses, a tradition. I'm going for tradition here. This is tradition. According to tradition, Moses comes down with the written Torah And let's just make sure. Amy says I'm okay. She's not dead. Okay, here it goes. And she's in some place that's completely safe, Bakery Square. She had to drop Ellie off, and she's like, if I'm in trouble, I'm going to call you. I'm like, you're in Bakery Square. Okay, so she's more dangerous than the people she's with. Okay, so she comes down with Moses comes down with the written Torah, but also right up here, the oral Torah. What is the oral Torah? It is the Torah from the word of God. It's the mouth of God. That's why it's oral. It's from the mouth of God. And so Moses comes down with the interpretation, traditionally, God's interpretation of the written Torah. It's called the Talmud, and it is passed down orally from Moses to the leaders of Israel from generation to generation. By the way, the original people of the Talmud are called Tinaim, which means to repeat, the repeaters. Now, I know and you know that if I repeat something for thousands of years, you would think something goes wrong with that. Okay, that's not for you. Okay, here it goes. So that's not Amy either. Okay, so back to so for thousands of years, the oral law is passed down from generation to generation, from mouth to mouth, and they say it was perfect, right? It's not the great operator or whatever telephone game. I whisper to Dan whispers to Susie whispers to Neil, Heidi, and then you get like, oh, how silly did you? Yeah. And then if you ever read Greek mythology, I'm a Greek mythology fan. There's always a storyteller, like the Iliad, Homer. There's a storyteller, and he's not a storyteller. Sorry, he tells the history, but over time, the stories change. And his daughter says, Dad, that's not what you told me 20 years ago. And he's like, no, yeah. So the idea is, but we're supposed to say it's perfect. So there are two Torahs, the oral written Torah, 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah, the Talmud. And so according to Orthodox tradition, the Talmud is the exact word of God. Okay, the word of God from Mount Sinai. Why? Okay, now let's go back to history for a moment. And again, if you study Talmud, and I was a Talmud major, I love Talmud. It's my favorite. No, very few people in rabbinical school became Talmud majors. You have to be a little touched in the head to be a Talmud major, because it's very dangerous to be a Talmud major. But it was me and in our class. Only 2 of us were Talmud majors. So back to history. Okay, we're living in Israel. We fight with each other. Assyrians come in and, blow away the North Israel. And then in 586 BCE, the Babylonians come in and destroy Jerusalem and send us to Babylonia. The Torah, think about the Torah we have. The Torah tells us how to be Jewish in Israel. All the laws are actually saying, when you enter Israel, then do the laws. Now we're out of Israel. Oh no, what are we going to do? We need to write down the oral law into a book. So it starts getting written traditionally in 586 BCE. Okay, so here's the date, 586 BCE. It starts getting written because we need to save that oral tradition or we're going to lose it while we're in exile in Babylonia. And it's finished in 500 CE. It's like 1,000 years. All right, so when I teach Talmud, I usually say it is 1,000. It's a book that's written 2,000 years ago. I just average it out to 0. So 500, say 0. So I say it's a 2,000-year-old book written for 1,000 years, written on 10,000 pages. The Talmud is 10,000 pages long. All right. That's why it takes 7 years to do the Talmud. They read 2 pages a day for 7 years, and you get a party. And it's 1,000 rabbis arguing with each other. Yeah. So now, if you study Talmud, how many people have studied Talmud before? Raise your hand. Anyone? No. All right. Good. I see a couple Talmud hands. Good. So Talmud hands. And now you'll know, the Talmud is a bunch of rabbis arguing for 10,000 pages. This rabbi says this, and this rabbi says this, and this rabbi says that, and they just and they argue for 10,000 pages. And what's great is the two rabbis who are arguing don't even live in the same century. Yeah, so you'll have one rabbi who says this and one rabbi says that, but they don't even know each other exists. One's long dead before the next one answers. So you have all these rabbis, and yes, you could ask the question, how do you get to that's the word of God? Yeah, any of you who grew up in Catholic school with nuns might remember, and that's none of you. But if you did, there were certain things you didn't ask in Catholic school. How do I know that? Because you become Jewish and then you tell me what you asked in the Catholic school and they hit you with a ruler. Well, if you're in Orthodox yeshiva and you're a little kid and they tell you this is the word of God and you go, how is a bunch of rabbis arguing for 10,000 pages the word of God? You don't ask that question. Honest to God, we never ask that question. You don't ask that question. Asking, I always talk about Louis Silverman. Louis Silverman, he's in Augusta, Georgia. He's long gone. He was like 100 years old when I met him. So Louis Silverman was in Augusta, Georgia, and he and I both went to yeshiva, not the same one, many years ago. And he says, he one time raised his hand. He says, I have a question, about Talmud. He says, why, something or other. And the rabbi says, let me explain why. He says, show me your hand. And he put your hand on the desk and he hits his hand with a ruler. Never ask why. So that's what you learn in yeshiva. So it's like nuns with beards and tzitzit. So the idea is the Talmud is the oral law, the word of God, traditionally speaking, from Mount Sinai, passed down from generation to generation, repeated, till finally written into the Talmud, a 10,000 page book that you can't stick in your pocket. And there are Talmud scholars. I might be a Talmud major. I will not call myself a Talmud scholar, but there are stories back in rabbi school before they had the internet that there were Talmud scholars and people have witnessed this, who could take a pin, like a straight pin, stick it through the Talmud and tell you what letter it was hitting as it was going through. Like it's hitting an aleph, it's hitting a bet. That's amazing. The problem is you can study Talmud your whole life and still not know what it means. There's no punctuation. There's no notes. There's no commentary. No one know the Talmud. And it's written in Aramaic. Okay, let's do a little more about what it is. It's written in Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew look the same, just as French and English looks. French and English have the same alphabet, but it's a different language. Aramaic and Hebrew have the same alphabet, but it's a different language. Here's a great one. If you know Hebrew a little, Aleph Yud Nun, Ain, Aleph Yud Nun, Ain. It means no in Hebrew, Ain. But guess what? Aleph Yud Nun in Aramaic, Ein, means yes. Okay? Now to get this straight, there's no dots in the Talmud. So we have this question going on for weeks. Rabbis are arguing the Talmud, and they say, and finally the answer is Aleph Yud Nun. We don't know if it's yes or no, because you sometimes are in Hebrew, and sometimes they can say it in English, in Aramaic. You don't know, and you don't have question marks or periods or exclamation marks in the Talmud. Instead of keep kosher, it could be keep kosher. So to understand the Talmud, what is really hard to understand. Now, nowadays we have, this is the Art Scroll. It's probably the best English translation of the Talmud. Okay. The Art Scroll is probably the best English translation of the Talmud, which is probably backwards for you because I just saw it frontwards. And the other one is Steinsaltz, but they didn't translate the whole thing in English. Then came Sefaria. Sefaria did put the entire Talmud on computer. When I was a kid, 30 years ago, there was an English version called the Sonsino, but the Sonsino was funny. It was the only English translation of the whole Talmud, except the Sonsino was a prude. And whenever the Talmud talked about poopy or penises, it skipped over the stuff. So you would have, you'd be reading in the Aramaic and go, but the translation does have nothing to do with it. They would just skip over anything that was like, not fun to translate. So it's not a very good translation. But it was the only translation. So let's go back to Talmud. Okay, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the oral law. If I was talking to a Catholic school, and I don't know if this is going to offend anyone here. When I talk to a Catholic school, I say, you've got the Old Testament and you got the New Testament. The Old Testament, we kind of all share. Christians, Jews, Muslims, all kind of look at our Old Testament and they kind of like, okay, the Old Testament, they're good with it. Then the Christians have the New Testament. All right, so the New Testament is, the Old Testament says, don't eat lobster. The New Testament says, go ahead. The Old Testament says, circumcise. The new one says, yeah, you don't have to circumcise. So the New Testament is the Christian, I call it the Christian commentary to the Old Testament. It is the Christian book of law based on the Old Testament. I call that, I'm going to call that the New Testament, the word of God for them. The Quran is the Muslim New Testament. And guess what the Talmud is? The Talmud is the Jewish New Testament. Okay, now don't go around saying that. Many the rabbis will kill you. But you know, when I teach a Catholic school, I say the Talmud is the Jewish New Testament. Now, I could also say the New Testament is the Christian Talmud. Could say that. And I could say the Quran is the Muslim Talmud. But here's the deal. I just said this in my Wednesday morning class. I don't know what day of the week today's what, Thursday. Yesterday in my Wednesday morning class, I said, we're studying the Bible. And I said, just because the Bible says it, doesn't mean we do it. Here's the thing that blows Jews' minds. Okay, that's such bad English. And it goes like this. We do not follow Torah law. Torah law is not Jewish law. There are many laws in the Torah that are bad. We do not stone our rebellious sons. We do not kill our daughters if they mess around. We do not cut our wives' hands off if they touch the wrong person. We do not do a lot of things in the Torah. Torah law is Torah law. Jewish law is the Talmud. The Talmud is Jewish law. The Talmud is the commentary to the Old Testament. We don't call it the Old Testament either, right? So, but the Hebrew Bible. And so therefore the Talmud is Jewish law. It's confusing and it's nasty and your head's going to fall off when you study it. As I explained to people why would you not want to study the Talmud? Here's why you don't want to study the Talmud. You're driving down the road, the freeway, and you see a sign that says speed limit 55. Now you know the speed limit and you can keep on driving 80. Okay, but you know the speed limit. Here's the deal. Do you want a sign that says how they got to 55? Do you know how long that sign would be? Could you imagine how they got to 55? I can't even imagine. Is it good for the economy? Is it better paint? Is it easy to remember? I don't know. I didn't study this. The Talmud is all of the commentary leading to the laws we do today. 10 pages, 20 pages, 100 pages on how to buy a cow. And by the way, most of the Talmud is not about God. It's about how to buy a cow. It's about how humans will live with humans. It's about equity and equity. And yeah, two people here. The first thing we ever studied in Talmud in rabbi school, how many years ago? 20, 25, 30, 31 years ago, something like that. 31 years ago, the first thing we ever studied in Talmud, this is it. Two people are walking on the street. They see a shirt lying in the middle of the street. Whose is it? That's and we spend months on this answer. Is it the person who sees it first? Is it the person who grabs it first? What if they grab it at the same time? Now you bring them, they're both holding on to this shirt, and now they go to a court of law. And the court of law has to answer, the judge has to answer, whose shirt is it? Well, you could cut the shirt in half, but that's not very helpful. Now you'll each have a half a shirt. So one person can have the shirt, and the person who has the shirt has to give half the money to the person who didn't get the shirt. Is that fair? And it goes into the Talmud is how to live life, 2,000 years ago, fairly. So we don't kill each other, right? There's like a little book. There's a little book in the Talmud on how to pray. Most of it is how to get divorced, how to get married, how to buy a cow, how to buy food and marketplace. So why isn't it neither since it was there to begin with? Okay, I don't know what that means. Okay, so question that came to me, I don't understand what it's saying. Okay, so the idea in the Talmud is how to live a life, but most humans just want the answer. They don't want the process. You want to eat your sausage. You don't want to know how you made the sausage. Okay. What do you got, Heidi? Raise your hand. Unmute. Go ahead.
Yep. So my question was, why isn't it neither of theirs, since neither one, it wasn't theirs to begin with? Why does either one of them have to claim that shirt?
Well, it's finders keepers. It's it's an
But how do
unclaimed
you
shirt.
not know the owner wouldn't come around and say, oh my God, I dropped my shirt. Where is it?
That's the if it's someone's shirt, then they would get it back. This is an ownerless shirt. Who knows? It fell off it fell out of the sky. It blew away from 100 miles away. Yeah, so we're not going to go into that story. That's just an example. We're not. We spent 2 months on it. Yeah, so just trust me on this one. This is just an example. Don't get tied on that one. So yeah, I can tell you how to buy a cow too, but and you could say, but don't worry about it. So but the question was, whose shirt is it? When they find it, make it and not a shirt. I don't know. Yeah, it's a dollar bill that blew down it was a windy day and it blew 1,000 miles away. No one will find the owner. So the deal is, the Talmud is how to live a life. Most humans just want the answer. Most humans do not want to know the process. The Talmud is the process. There is a story. It's a true story. There is a Israeli prime minister was talking to the South Korean prime minister. And the South Korean prime minister was saying, the South Korean prime minister quoted the Talmud. And the Israeli prime minister says, what? Did you just quote the Talmud? And the South Korean prime minister says, and Israel did not know this at the time, that the South Koreans were studying Talmud in college. It's required study in South Korea. What happened? The story goes that the South Koreans were studying different people, and they found that the Jews, Neil, you'll like this, the Jews seem to be, upward mobility kind of people, especially educationally. So they try to figure out why are Jews so educated and care so much about education, and they decided it must be the Talmud, and they start teaching the Talmud to their people. And so there are South Koreans running around the world who study the Talmud, probably a lot more than the Jews do today. And what do they call it? They call it logic, like logical, like logic. And because when we study the Talmud in rabbi school, we'd have a big blackboard. That was a back thing, green thing. We used to write on them with chalk, and we would outline the Talmud because it would take weeks to take apart an argument. And because the Talmud is made up of, and here it goes. Let me take a breath. The Talmud is made up of 2 parts. I'm going to put it in your chat box. Here we go. Let me get to my chat box. Okay, so you can see the words. It's the Talmud equals Mishnah plus Gemara. There you go. Look in your chat box. This is a mathematical formula. Talmud equals Mishnah and Gemara. Okay, so here it goes. So I told you 586 BC to 500 CE. There are 2 things that make up Talmud. 2 parts, and only 2 parts, Mishnah and Gemara. Mishnah is the original nuggets of law, written in Hebrew, by the way, the original nuggets of law. And then Gemara is the Aramaic commentary to those Mishnah. So you'll have a Mishnah and then a Gemara. And you'll have a Mishnah and then a Gemara. Mishnah, I can fit Mishnah into about this big. Okay, I have it's 6 books. It's about this big. I can fit Mishnah into about this much in my hands. I can hold a Mishnah. And then the Gemara, 10,000 pages. I would not be strong enough to hold the Gemara. Okay, so Mishnah are small nuggets of law written in Hebrew. That's finished about 200 CE. Okay, so about 200 CE, Mishnah is over. Gemara keeps on being written until 500 CE, and it's written in Aramaic because that's what we're speaking in Babylonia. That's a Babylonian thing. And we're living in, remember I said we got exiled to Babylonia. Let's go back to history for a second. Once upon a time, we are living in Israel. The Babylonians come in, they destroy Jerusalem, and now they move us to Babylonia. There were a few leftover riffraffs in Israel, but most people were moved over to Babylonia. And guess what? They let us live in Babylonia, survive. Not, they let us set up schools in Babylonia called Sura and Pumbedita, famous yeshiva. Sura, I could S-U-R-A and Pumbedita. Don't, just trust me. And in Babylonia, we get to be Jewish, study Judaism, write the Talmud. And so what is this Talmud called? Okay, you can see it here. Is this backwards, by the way, for you guys? When I put this up here? Okay. No? Okay. So this says Talmud Bavli, which means the Babylonian Talmud. Okay. Bavli is Babylonia. So it's the Babylonian Talmud. And so it's written, the first nugget is Mishnah, and then it's written in Aramaic, the Babylonian Talmud. So here's the deal. There are some Jews living in Israel, but what did Babylonia, whenever you take over a world, when you have an empire, a vast empire, here's the secret. When you have a vast empire, what you do is you come in, you destroy anyone who's messing with you, so everyone's going to behave. And then you kind of set up some people there and they pay taxes. And then because you can't control with an iron fist an entire world, you just want everyone to behave and pay your taxes. But you know what you do is you want to make your center stronger. So what you do is I'm sorry, I need to go. We'll catch the rest on recording. Oh, good. So Susie left. Okay. So here's the deal. What Babylonia does is it takes all the best of Jerusalem, of Israel, and sends it back to Babylonia. The smartest people, the strongest people, the science, the math, the whiz kids, the scholars, they all go to, the sports heroes, they all go to Babylonia, and they just leave like the riffraff in Jerusalem, in Israel, because you want to make the center stronger. If you ever study the book of Daniel, the book of Daniel is about a whiz kid who was taken from Israel and brought to Babylonia and becomes a king's advisor because he's a whiz kid. All right. So where are the smartest of Jews? They're in Babylonia. So there's a Babylonian Talmud being written in Babylonia, but guess what? There's another Talmud being written. There's another Talmud being written in Jerusalem called the Jerusalem Talmud. If I told you that there were two Talmuds in the world, a Jerusalem Talmud and a Babylonian Talmud, you would think the Jerusalem Talmud was the authoritative one, the one that won. It is not. Whenever a rabbi says Talmud, they only mean the Babylonian Talmud. They'd have to say in the Jerusalem Talmud or Yerushalmi, because the Jerusalem Talmud has a lot of problems. One, the best scholars are in the other place. Number two, the Babylonian Talmud keeps on getting written after the Jerusalem Talmud, so it has the last word. So it can actually comment and say the Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud can say in the Jerusalem Talmud it says this, but they're wrong. So you get the last word. And so what happens is the Jerusalem Talmud, you're going to hear there's a by the way, they also call it the Palestinian Talmud, is not the authoritative Talmud. When a rabbi says Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud becomes law. Now, I'm a conservative. I've been telling you the Orthodox tradition. In the Orthodox tradition, right? Word of God. Except I know, and by the way, the rabbis in the Talmud know they're rabbis, they're not God. The rabbis in the Talmud do not say they speak for God. The rabbis are just talking amongst each other, and then someone later on said they're speaking for God. Don't get me started. So I call this rabbinic law, and I call the Torah, if I had a Torah in my hand, it's over there. Okay, but if I had a Torah in my hand, I'd say that's God's law if I wanted to, and this is rabbi law. And even the rabbis in the Talmud say that. The rabbis say, well, this is what God said, if it's in the 5 books of Moses, and this is what we say. And they understood that. How does the Talmud become authoritative? I've told this story a billion times. story go in the Talmud, by the way, and the Talmud explains that when God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, it was a gift from God, but then it became our responsibility to keep it alive and comment on it and understand it and live by it, not die by it. And therefore, even if we got it wrong, if we misunderstood what God meant in the Torah, it doesn't matter. It's still our job to interpret it. All right, so you know how I explain the Talmud? Anyone ever study constitutional law? You've heard of the Constitution before? Just say yes. Okay, you've heard of the Constitution before. Have you heard of the Supreme Court before? Now, this is not a political debate. Let's go back to the days when we trusted the Constitution and the Supreme Court. Let's just go, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when like the Supreme Court was, what it was and whatever. Okay, so here it goes. What is the Supreme Court's job? It's just, when someone brings something to the Supreme Court, they should look at the Constitution and then make a decision. Now, it's interesting. Some of them will say, well, what were the constitutional writers thinking at the time? Or maybe they'll say, if you could transport the constitutional writers to today, what they would say, not what did they say, hundreds of years ago, or who cares what they said? It was hundreds of years ago. You can say any of that as a constitution, as a Supreme Court justice. And if you studied constitutional law, which was one of my favorite courses in law in college, I love constitutional law. If you ever study constitutional law, what is constitutional law? Anyone ever study constitutional law? No, it's great. You would hate it, but it's great. What is constitutional law? So yes, we have a law like Roe versus Wade, right? You've heard of that one. So you've heard, but you ever read what happens when they put out a judgment? There's usually three things they send out. They send out the winning opinion, they send out the losing opinion, and they send out like the concurring opinion. And so there's usually like three opinions that are released from the Supreme Court: the winning, the losing, and the concurring. And when you study constitutional law, you read all of that stuff. And by the way, when you're a lawyer and you go to law, you go to a court, you can quote some guy who said something 100 years ago in the Supreme Court. As Justice, Smith said in 1872, in what's it called versus what's it called, you can quote even the losing opinion, because they were using some type of, constitutional, thinking. That's what the Talmud is. The Talmud, if the Torah is our constitution, if the Torah, the Bible, is our constitution, the Talmud is the Supreme Court decisions. There's winning opinions and losing opinions, right? Everything's in the Talmud. And by the way, not just anything. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yossi says this, Rabbi Smith says that, which reminds me, Rabbi Smith used to walk with a cane upside down, and like a rabbi, they would just go on tangents and tell stories because everything's in the Talmud. It takes so long to figure out where you are in the Talmud, because, by the way, some people call it swimming in the sea of Talmud. Some people say drowning in the sea of Talmud. But the idea is the Talmud is just everything. There's no order to it. It's a circle. There's no the Talmud will quote something in one page and say, oh, on page 7,630, it mentions this. But on page 7,684, it'll mention something on page 3. There's no order to it. There's no index. There's no table of contents. Each book is a different topic, but the topics could lead to anything. You're talking about weddings, you're going to talk about divorce. You're going to talk about divorce. You might be talking about, getting rid of your animal. You could be talking. And so the Talmud is just a big circle of law. Now, the greatest rabbi in history, other than me, is Maimonides, or my wife. Maimonides said, you know what? No one can understand the Talmud. He writes something called the Guide to the Perplexed, the Mishnah Torah, and he takes only the laws out of the Talmud. He writes a book of only the laws. Like instead of 10,000 pages, here's the laws okay. Back in rabbi school, we spent 2 months on the first thing, the buying the cow thing. And we're going back and forth, and we're back and forth. And we finally get to this end. And the teacher says, tomorrow we will get to the answer. So we're all so excited. We're going to get the answer tomorrow. We come to school, we come to class, we're studying the Talmud. He turns the page over and there's a word. It says teku. What does teku mean? We have no idea. We'll know when the Messiah comes. And then we move on to the next topic. So it is unbelievable. Talmud is just an unbelievable living, breathing, document. And when as a rabbi today, I have arguments with the rabbi. I was talking to a rabbi yesterday. I had lunch with a rabbi yesterday. And I said to him, we count people on Zoom, even if their camera's off. And because the conservative movement, one rabbi in the conservative movement put out one law in the conservative movement that says your camera has to be on. And I'm like, that's his opinion. I disagree with him. I said, if the Talmudic rabbis, this is what I said to him yesterday, if the Talmudic rabbis were alive here today, they would agree with me. And basing it on, and how do I base it? I said, in the Talmud, there was a losing opinion. Okay, there was a losing opinion in the Talmud that said that if you had 9 people in a room and a 10th person was walking by the open window and could hear and respond amen to the blessing, he can count as number 10. All right, so you can have 10 people if the 10th person can respond amen to your blessings, even though you can't see him, and you can't hear him, but he can hear you and respond amen. And ever since then, I've allowed, so since then, before the pandemic, Sue Ellen Schatzer, if you know Sue Ellen, she's bedridden. Sue Ellen Schatzer is at home one Friday night. There's a Pirates game, and that we always hurt our minions when we had a Pirates game because 2 of our regulars would go to the Pirates games. So we had 9 people in the room, and Sue Ellen Schatzer had Yortzeit. So she was on the phone. I had my phone with me on the stand, and she was listening to the service because she wanted to be there for the name reading and to say Kaddish. So we have 9 people plus Sue Ellen listening on the phone. And I'm like, she hears us, she responds. We can't hear her or see her. I counted her as number 10 before there was a pandemic and before there was Zoom. So I explained to this rabbi, he's like, I'm going to do that now too. But I'm basing it on a minority opinion in the Talmud. You ever come to my synagogue and when we had 9 people, we opened the ark for the 10th. Where did that come from? Talmud. In the Talmud, there was a minority opinion that says you can open the ark for number 10. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the most famous Orthodox rabbi in history, modern Orthodox rabbi in history, uses that for that. He used that opinion for emergency purposes to open the ark, not just crazy me, based on the Talmud. So the Talmud is made up of 2 things, laws and stories. Right? There's laws and there's stories. Which reminds us of a story. And maybe you can understand some stories. That's called halacha. Halacha means law. Agada, A-G-G-A-D-A-H. Agada sounds like Haggadah, not a coincidence. Same word, to tell a story. So the Talmud is made up of laws and stories. Now, I'm going to do something that's probably a mistake. I'm going to try to show you a page of Talmud on your screen. That's good. Oh, this is a pretty good one. Okay. So here we go. Okay. Here's a page of Talmud. Okay. I'll move it back a little. That is a pretty good looking page of Talmud. All right. They can be different shapes and sizes, but that's a very good looking page. It looks like I almost like to say, like what you shoot arrows at, like a target. Like there's a circle in the middle, and then it gets and the words get smaller and smaller on the sides too. So let me explain what you're looking at here. This section, the middle section, every time is the Talmud. That's Mishnah and Gemara. Hey, let me get my finger. That's Mishnah and Gemara. So I'll just show you another page just to give you an idea how it can change a little. Yeah, that looks so much similar. Yeah. Yeah, well, here's one. So that middle page, right? Let me get my fingers right. So everything's backwards. Okay, so that's a lot of Mishnah and Gemara, right? But then you can also have a page that has itsy bitsy. Let's give you a little itsy bitsy look, and then I'm gonna explain more what you're looking at. Okay. Ugh. 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 I'm gonna give up in a second, just give you an easy page. Because some of these pages have just a little square in the middle and then a lot around the edges. But I'm gonna give up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, given. Good. So we'll go back to this page. Fine. Okay. So back to Talmud. So the middle part is the Mishnah Gemara. That's all that's Talmud. On the edges, okay, on the edges are commentary. This is Rashi. Sorry, this is Rashi, the most famous commentator, commentary on the entire Torah and the entire Talmud. No guy could have lived that long, so it's his students as well. On this side is Tosafot. That's Rashi's grandsons, and so that's more commentary. Right here, right, is Maimonides, just a list of laws from this page, and then there's more commentary, and then there's guys in the back of the book too. So Talmud is just the middle part, and everything else is commentary. And when you study Talmud, you spend a long time trying to understand what it's saying. It's because there is no punctuation. There is no Aramaic. Now, by the way, when I told you Aramaic is not Hebrew, that's true. Except if you know Hebrew, Aramaic is not so hard because it's got the same roots. So I found Aramaic not that hard. I didn't mind Aramaic. Once you start figuring out how to, if you know Hebrew, Aramaic is not that hard. It's not the same as French to English. So you can, so being able to study the Bible, you can move the Bible to Aramaic not so poorly. It's similar. The language is similar. And what Rashi does is Rashi explains things that's going along, and Tosafot will take a topic. But the Talmud is all about, again, living our lives. And the Talmud is Jewish book of law. It is, if you study the Bible backwards and forwards, you memorize the Bible. You can wear a black tie and go to people's doors and say, do you know what it says in the book of Isaiah? No, don't do that. But Jews don't follow the Bible. We follow the Talmud, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not. What makes you Jewish? Keeping kosher? Maybe. Keeping Shabbat? Maybe. Keeping Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Hanukkah. Maybe it's how you give charity. Maybe it's how you treat animals. All of that's in the Talmud. How do you bless your bread or light candles for Shabbat? Talmud. All of that's in the Talmud. So what makes Jews is the Talmud. The Bible does not make us Jewish. It's our origin story. It's how we got here. But it's the Talmud that tells us to be Jewish. So when someone attacks the Talmud, they love doing that with me. Oh, Rabbi, God never said don't eat a cheeseburger. I'm like, that's true. God said you should kill your rebellious son. You're going to go do that? The Talmud says don't eat a cheeseburger. So I don't eat a cheeseburger because the Talmud says so. Now, I know a lot of people eat cheeseburgers. I'm not judging, but I can tell you that all the stuff that makes you Jewish is in the Talmud. It is the Jewish book of law. And so when I always tell you about my drunk friend who gets mad about Judaism every time he's drunk. He says, it says in the Torah. I said, it doesn't matter what it says in the Torah. It matters what it says in the Talmud. And the story goes that, this is God's oral law, God's commentary. And so when Rabbi Amy was teaching a class in Squirrel Hill at the JCC, and I go there to support her. And so I'm sitting in the back row, and it's her and this Orthodox rabbi, and they're teaching a class on, I don't know, I think it was capital punishment. I don't know what it was. And so Amy says, it says in the Torah this. And then the rabbi next to her says, but it also says in the Torah this. And Amy says, well, not exactly, because it doesn't say what that rabbi said in the Torah. It says it in the Talmud. But the rabbi considers the Talmud Torah. So what happens is rabbis, I make a distinction between Torah and Talmud. I say Torah, you know what the Torah is, but if I say it's there are some bad things in the Talmud. Anyone who's, Heidi's in my Wednesday morning class. I don't think anyone else is in my Wednesday, but we study the Talmud. The Talmud says, remember, it's 10,000 pages, 1,000 rabbis. Some of them were not nice people, and so they say some bad things about women. Not all the Talmud. That Talmud is a book, but one rabbi says something terrible. And so could you say that in the Talmud, it says you should punch your wife in the nose? Sure. There is a rabbi in the Talmud who says you should punch your wife in the nose. We don't follow that rabbi, but could I argue that it says in oral law you can punch your wife in the nose? Sure, but that would be really reprehensible. What do you got, Heidi? You were going to say something, Heidi?
I say, yes, it doesn't say, it does say, it never says anything good about women in the Talmud. It's always, and whenever mentioned, it's always bad.
Well, it's a bunch of men who were writing, they left their wives at home, were getting drunk, spending, there's no women's voices in the Talmud. And so, it's like the Southern Baptist Convention. I always loved it. Back when I lived in Augusta, Georgia, they were all Baptists. And every once a year, I think, or they had a Southern Baptist Convention where all the men went to like Atlanta and they made rules for the Southern Baptists, and they would come home and their wife would say, how'd it go? Oh, it's fine, honey. And the next day you'd see in the newspaper, Southern Baptist Convention decides that women should be quiet. It's like the Talmud. It's a bunch of men, who can say anything they want because their wives aren't listening. They are terrible with cooking too, by the way. They seem to have no idea how to cook in the rules.
They're clueless.
What do you got, Heidi?
Well, I had a question just to clarify. So the Talmud is our oral law?
Correct.
Okay, now wait, I got to finish. So that's what we follow. So I know we read Torah on Shabbat. Where does it say that we're supposed to read the Torah, and why, if there's no laws in the Torah that we follow?
It gets better. The Talmud is the one that tells us to read the Torah on Shabbat. So again, the Torah doesn't tell us to read the Torah on Shabbat. The Talmud does. The Talmud tells us to read the Torah. So the Torah, again, okay, let me explain. You're getting a conservative rabbi's view of what I was just saying, but here's the deal. If you're Orthodox, when I said that God says, do not cook a baby goat his mother's milk. And then the Talmud says no cheeseburgers. For the Orthodox, that there's no problem with that. There is no problem whatsoever, because that is what God meant when it was written that way in the Torah. The Talmud can never disagree with the Torah. Okay, here's a famous one. It says in the Torah, eye for an eye. If someone pokes your eye out, poke their eye out. Sorry, optometrist. So if you poke, and that's what the Torah says. Eye for an eye, wound for a wound, life for a life. Very straightforward. The Talmud says, eye for an eye, a real eye. What are you, crazy? God meant money. Eye for an eye, do not, and this is what it says in the Talmud, ayin tachat ayin, mamash, lo, ayin tachat ayin, mamon. Eye for an eye, real eye? No, eye for an eye, the value of an eye. And then they spend like 100 pages trying to value an eye. Do you know how hard it is to value an eye? How much is it worth to lose your eye? How much is it worth to keep an eye? How much is your pain worth? How much would you pay not to have that pain? What if you're an Air Force pilot? Well, they need their eye. If I lose my eye, I'm just a one-eyed rabbi. So there's a lot of different ways of judging. So here's the deal. So the Torah says one thing, the Talmud says another, but the Talmud, the way that we're taught is the Talmud is the exact meaning of the Torah words. They're not different for the Orthodox. I think the rabbis made it up, but I'm okay with it. I don't want to poke each other's eyes out. And here goes Ellen, and like stone your rebellious son. The Talmud can't say don't stone your rebellious son. They said, but you don't have this is what a rebellious son is, and they limit it so it's impossible to follow. Ellen, what do you got?
Okay, I have been taking classes Chinese, the Quran and all that, they draw from the Old Testament, and that when they bring some of the things up, they're good examples. When you listen to what the rabbis do, they don't seem to agree with anything. I mean, you can even have the Orthodox and they still don't agree. So how are you, as a layperson who doesn't have all this deep knowledge, supposed to decide? Should it be this or should it be that? You can have a rabbi, like you would come in my house and another rabbi said, no, I don't go in your house, but you're both right.
Right. And the answer is the three movements. Okay, so the three movements, and we'll study movements eventually. One of our topics is the three movements, conservative, Orthodox, and Reform. Okay, so what is the individual supposed to do with this knowledge? In the Orthodox, do whatever your rabbi says. It's very simple. You don't have to make any decisions. You know, I know keeping kosher is hard, but I can tell you, you know what's harder? Reading labels. It's a little easier just to find an OU on your food. And if there's no OU, you can't eat it. And then you go, you know, yes, you're limited in what you can eat, but in a way, you don't have to think. You can turn your brain off and just do what your rabbi says, right? The farther right you go, if your rabbi says jump off a bridge, you do it. No questions asked. And there are people who jump off bridges because the rabbi said so. Now, that's Orthodox. And the Reform movement, you're supposed to study this stuff and then decide on your own. You should study the laws of kosher and then say, does it work for me? And the conservative movement, the answer is you have choices within a structure. So you can eat out vegetarian, according to the conservative movement. You can eat out vegetarian, or you can eat in, you know, kosher, but you can't eat out non-kosher. I mean, that's not within the conservative movement. So it is confusing, Ellen. And by the way, there's not just three movements. I'm just cheating. There's also Reconstructionist and Humanist, and, you know, and renewal. And every day there's a new movement. But the answer is, it is confusing, Ellen, because we have 3,000 years of rabbis saying 3,000 things. However, in the different movements give you that wiggle room. If you're Orthodox, you just do whatever they tell you. Reform, do whatever you want. And the conservative says, we have a law committee. When we study the conservative movement, there's a law committee, and the law committee studies the laws based on the Talmud and the Torah, and then says, what would the rabbi say today about Zoom? What do you got, Neil? Oh, wait, Ellen, finish up. Go ahead.
That may be true, but we move forward, and things that may have been true before have changed. So the reasons for not doing something must have changed too.
Right. And by the way, that's a big thing when you study Talmud. If the Talmud says this is the reason we're doing it, and that reason no longer holds true, then that changes the law with it. So unfortunately, kind of like keeping kosher, God never says why we should keep kosher. Is it for health reasons? I think so, but it doesn't matter because God never says it's for health reasons. Because if it was for health reasons, we could say pork is healthy. But it isn't. I mean, it is, but we can't eat pork. So the answer is, you're right, Ellen. As times change, like when I study abortion, as science changes, it changes our rules for abortion. So you're right. This is like talking about the Constitution and the Supreme Court. As times change, law has to change too. And that's, of course, I'm a conservative rabbi. Neil, then Irv.
Rashi and his sons.
Rashi's and his no sons. Rashi has daughters, famous books, Rashi's daughters. Rashi has daughters, and her daughters have grandsons. So there's Rashi's and grandsons. Go on.
So they're commenting on the Talmud, right?
Right. The two columns, right and left.
So if the rabbis are debating all this stuff, what's Rashi trying to do?
So it's a great question. When you study the Torah, when I teach Torah or Bible to Christians, I use Rashi, and this is a true statement. Rashi is the Jewish commentary to the Bible. Okay, so yeah, Rashi is the fill in the blank kind of guy, and he fills in the blanks, and that's what he does with Talmud. So the way Rashi works is this. If you had a line in the Bible or the Talmud that says the dog runs fast, Rashi would take those words, the dog, and then he would add in whose name is Fido, runs, does not walk fast to get to the market. And that becomes, by the way, the Jewish take on what I just said. So you would say Jews believe that dogs run fast to get to markets. I don't know. I'm just making that up, obviously. But the idea is Rashi is the great clarifier. So that's what Rashi, that's how Rashi's commentary worked. And you weren't allowed, by the way, this is where I got in trouble in rabbi school. You weren't allowed to disagree with Rashi. And I'm like, why not? Yeah, why can't, I say this in my classes when I teach. I go, and Rabbi Heidi says, and Rabbi Rochelle says this, and Rabbi Georgia says that. They're all women. And Rabbi Fern says that, and I'm like, because, I think we have, just as Ellen kind of said, we've learned life has changed a little. I think that Rabbi Ellen can say that, and Rashi didn't go to rabbi school either, but Rashi would disagree with me the other way. Rashi explains why we should listen to him. He says, because he's smarter than everyone else and you're an idiot if you don't believe him. That's what Rashi says. But Rashi is the most famous Jewish commentator, and most rabbis quote Rashi as the final word.
So after Rashi and his grandsons,
Tosafot. By the way, they're called the Tosafot. Yeah.
so is there any more commentary added to the Talmud after that?
Yeah. So there's Rashi and Tosafot, they're on every page. And then there's more commentaries on the side columns. And then half the books, the back of the book, we call them the guys in the back of the book. It looks like Talmud is more and more commentary. There's like 10 or 15 commentators in every Talmud. And by the way, if it was easy to understand, they wouldn't need all these commentaries. That's why there's only one book in the Talmud that has no commentary, and it's called Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our ancestors. A lot of rabbis like studying Pirkei Avot because it's the easiest book of the Talmud to understand. It has no commentary.
So the commentaries are still, as I understand, the commentaries are still going on though, right?
Well, okay, so I'm in rabbi school and I say, why can't we do it? Because Mr. Teacher, we started having Mrs. Teachers at the end. When I said, we have like space right here, there it goes. We have space to write. And all the teachers had notes here. I go, why don't we add another layer? And that's, so I think we're all doing that. I think that's what we're doing tonight. I believe that we're always building on the Torah. I want to put the Torah in the middle, then the Talmud, then the commentaries, and then us. I'm making that like, arrow shooting thing, whatever it's called, a target. But yeah, I agree, Neil. And by the way, this is how I got in school trouble, because I said, why do we have to stop with the guys in the back of the book? And what makes them more right than us? Yeah.
Are there still people writing authoritative pieces in the Talmud today?
Sure. I mean, the Talmud we're studying, this is Art Scroll, has a running commentary by the Art Scroll rabbis. Yeah, it's Chabad rabbi talk, but no one can understand the Talmud without a little help. That you study in Chavruta. My Chavruta, my study partner in Talmud, now runs a lesbian gay Talmud school in Chicago. She's like famous, but she and I were our Talmud partners back in the old days. Now she's like a famous, queer Talmud scholar. And of course I got bad grades because I didn't show up for the tests, but I did love Talmud. All right, Joe, Herb, you had a question?
Yes. As an ophthalmologist and who also spent a couple of years as an Air Force flight surgeon, I agree, an eye for an eye would not be good for an Air Force pilot. But I do have a question going back to where we started about Moses being up on Mount Sinai, writing the 5 books of Moses. A large part of the 5 books of Moses took place after Mount Sinai. Was he and they getting a preview of what was coming?
So now this is not Talmud, this is Torah, right? The 5 books of Moses. So you read the story and Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and comes down with the Torah. And yet the Torah has 3 more books, right? He gets it pretty early on in Exodus, right? He's got Exodus, we go up there, he gets the Torah. And all of a sudden we got Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the tradition, there's no one answer to this. Of course, we're Jews. Thanks, Ellen. There's always more than one answer, but the answer is there's 2 choices. One, Moses came down just with what happened up to then and kept on writing the 5 books of Moses. Number 2, which I like more, this is the one I like, because the 613 commandments are in the rest of the books. Most of them are not before. If you you were at the class, Rabbi Schiff taught a class on mitzvahs years ago, and he explained that like only a few mitzvahs are in Bereshit, the first book. Most of them are in the last books. So, and if Moses came down with the 613 commandments, that means Moses did come down with the future, which I love. If you're a science fiction fan, I don't know any of you science fiction freaks like I am, this is great stuff. So Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, gets the 5 books of Moses, which means he gets all of his mistakes. He gets when he's going to die. He gets everything, right? He's going to get the 5 books of Moses. And here's the key. If you deviate, we're not here. You and I are not here today. So Moses is the greatest guy in history because he's given the Torah, the future, and still has to go through the same mistakes, right? He still has to hit that rock afterwards. And so I love that commentary more because I just can't I love getting my mind around this idea that the guy got everything, comes down with it, and then has to like go through the motions. So there's no good answer to what I just said. There's no one answer. So the number 2 answers are, it keeps getting written afterwards. He only has up to then. But number 2, I like more. He has the future and he has to follow the future to a T, or else, it doesn't work. Yeah, which science fictionally you love, because if you anyone who studies science fiction and time travel and fixing mistakes, you always make it worse if you do. By the way, Irv, so when it came to the eye for an eye thing, the answer was, the Air Force pilot's eye was worth so much more. If you poked an eye, again, if you blinded an Air Force pilot whose life was over, his career is over, you owed him a lot more money than if you poked a rabbi's eye out. Now if you poke my tongue out, I don't know how. I think I could be a blind rabbi. I don't think I could not walk. Most rabbis don't hear. So the only thing you can't have is a rabbi with no tongue. I think that's
You could sign, Rabbi.
What's that?
You could sign. You don't
could
have to have a
sign.
tongue.
That's great. I'll find a great congregation for that. It's they'll pay me a lot of money. Yes.
Well, you never know.
That's true. And aliens can give me my tongue back. But so all right. So we that's Talmud. By the way, it was Talmud and Midrash. So Midrash is something in the Talmud. Midrash are rabbinic stories, rabbi stories. And you can have rabbi stories in the Talmud. You can have rabbi stories outside of the Talmud. Abraham and his father's idol shop, that's a Midrash. It's not a Bible. It's not in the Bible. It's not law. It's Midrash. Moses burnt his tongue, and that's how he got a speech impediment. That's Midrash. There are children's books are Midrash, but you can also have adult Midrash. You can have there's a big book of Midrash called Genesis Rabbah, Rabbah. It's a classic Midrash. That was a great thing. By the way, if I wasn't a Talmud major, I would have been a Midrash major. David Wolpe, the most famous conservative rabbi in the world right now, he was a Midrash major. So he and I were in school together, but he's a few years ahead of me, but we worked in the library together. So I was Talmud, he was Midrash. He's much more famous. And so, but Midrash is all the rabbi stories that are not in the Bible. That's the key. Midrash are rabbi stories that are not in the Bible. They can be in the Talmud, but they can also be on their own. So Talmud is really what we're focusing on tonight. The oral law, you hit a lot of things. All your questions were good. It means this is a hard thing to understand, a really hard thing to understand. And Daniel Siegel, before his father passed away, Daniel Siegel studied the Talmud with his father. And he comes to me and goes, how in the heck can you believe this came from God? And anyone who studies Talmud has to ask that question. Those are questions we didn't ask in Orthodox Yeshiva, but that doesn't change what it means to our people. Most of us do not walk around knowing what the Talmud says, and most rabbis lie and says it's in the Torah, but they mean the Talmud. But the Talmud is the oral law, whether we like it or not. And someone asked me recently about Reform Judaism. And I said, Reform Judaism agrees with Orthodox Judaism that there's these laws. The only difference is Orthodox says you have to follow and Reform says you have a choice. So they both, the law stays the same. It's just a question of whether you follow or not. The conservative movement changes the law with the time. It's a little, the funny thing is Reform and Orthodox are closer than the conservative. The conservative believes that we're continuing the process of Talmud. Like the question that Neil just asked, I argue that the closest authentic Judaism today is conservative Judaism. I know it's having trouble, blah, blah, blah. But I believe we're doing what the Talmud did. Where that to say that law stopped was never a Jewish idea. That you can do anything you want was not a Jewish idea. But the idea that we continue working through the law and fighting about it and trying to make it work for us today, that I believe what we're doing today. I believe Zoom was a great example of Talmud for our age. How do we be Jewish when we're locked in our homes for 2.5 years? And how, and it's not just do whatever you want. What would I channel the rabbi, I go, what would the Talmudic rabbis have said? And no one can prove me wrong, but I think of course I think I'm right. The Orthodox would say like fire, electricity. Well, they didn't have electricity 2,000 years ago, so they mentioned fire, so you can't use electricity. Then I would say they don't know what electricity is. What would they have said if they knew electricity? Not what did they talk about fire? It's like talking about the Constitution. Do we care what they were thinking at the time or their thought process at the time? And do times change? What was the fear of the constitutional writers, and today's fears might be different. So I do look at the Talmud as the Supreme Court decisions based on the Constitution, which is our Torah. So that's it. It's 8:05. You survived another introduction to Judaism. Our next class. Okay, here we go. I've just been a little out of my mind here. Let me go into it. Gmail. There's something I wanted to find. Good. Okay. Talmud, Midrash, Holocaust. Okay. Let's see. Where is it? Okay. Susan, Wednesday, Holocaust, Israel, movements.
Isn't it November 27th, Rabbi? Is that what I have?
Well, no, I'm looking for the next topic. Oh, the next topic is one of our oldies but goodies. Okay, what date did you find, Heidi? I do need that.
But that
too.
can't be. That's November 27th. That's Thanksgiving weekend.
That doesn't sound good. So we'll have to find another date for that. Let me see if I already moved it somewhere. November 27th. Nope, I got to move that because that's Thanksgiving weekend. And I haven't put it on. Actually, I'm going to tell you right now. It's going to be Thursday night, December 1st at 7:00. But no one knows that except for you people. So Thursday night, December 1st is going to be it. And I'm going to tell you the topic right now too. It is, and some of you have studied with me before, but now it's, instead of spending 12 months on it, we're doing 1 hour on it. It's Kabbalah. So it's a 1 hour Kabbalah class instead of 12 months. So you buckle your seatbelts, Kabbalah in 1 hour December 1st. Not Thanksgiving, Sunday, because I'll be in Arizona for my 3rd time in 6 weeks. So it's suffering in Arizona.
Are you still going to have one on December 25th?
I don't know. It's December 25th. That sounds like I'm out. That sounds like Christmas. December 25th?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not worried. I don't worry. That's a long. Yeah, we don't worry about that yet. We worry about November. All right, so
I'll be good for that. I don't know where in Florida I'll be, but I will be in Florida.
and I'll be in Arizona again. So that's another Arizona time. I'll be in Arizona this weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, and Christmas weekend. So it's a lot of Arizona. Too much Arizona. Don't tell my
So
wife.
most of these classes are getting on Thursdays, not Sundays.
Yeah, if I had a Sunday, it'd be there. All right, so have a great night. Bob, Cindy, Deanne, Neil, Heidi, Joan, Richard, Ellen, and if Susie, if you listen to this recording, God bless you. Have a good night.
By the
And
way,
go Houston.